If you've had a long career in healthcare, chances are that you've received a complaint. It could be about the way you spoke to a patient, a mistake, or simply a misunderstanding about the treatment that you provided. And it's never been easier for people to complain, whether it's through a simple online form or just taking to social media. But a professional complaint from a colleague can land very differently and hurt us more deeply. This week, I'm joined by Dr. George Wright, legal consultant and Deputy Dental Director of Dental Protection. Now, George had a complaint made against him earlier in his career, which he believes led him to the work he does now, helping other healthcare professionals navigate the complaints process. One of the things we discuss is the often unintended escalation that so-called blue-on-blue complaints may trigger, even if the person wants to withdraw the complaint later. This often leads to long and drawn-out proceedings on both sides and often no resolution for either party. So we talk about what to do instead of going straight for the nuclear option, and also when the nuclear option is necessary. And if you've experienced anything like this, or you'd like to know what to do should a complaint land on your desk, this in-depth conversation with George will give you the resources you need to take the right next step.
My name's George Wright. I'm a general dentist by background. I now work full-time for Dental Protection, which is part of the Medical Protection Society, as a dental legal consultant and Deputy Dental Director.
It's great to have you on the podcast, George. Thank you so much for coming on. And I think this conversation is going to be really interesting because the one thing that I know doctors, dentists, nurses, healthcare professionals fear above all things is complaints. And this fear of complaints drives so much of our behaviour, whether it's, avoiding saying no because we don't want to upset anybody, or just over investigating because we don't want to get things wrong, or just doing stuff that we probably wouldn't normally do, but just because we are so worried that the patient is upset, or maybe one of our colleagues is watching over our shoulder. And so we end up making these decisions out of fear rather than out of our deep intuition, knowing that that's the best thing to do. So obviously you're a complete expert in this area. Just very quickly, what sort of complaints are you seeing at the moment in general?
Well, yes, there has been a change in trends. We've had COVID, which of course was a complete anomaly in itself. But in more recent times, the real driver, I think, and the thing that's really changed up the way patients approach their healthcare is social media. So with social media comes a real change in patient expectations. Patients are more aware of what they are, let's say, entitled to. They're more aware of what can be achieved and what can be delivered. And they're also more aware of what tools they have at their disposal when things go wrong, be that complaints to clinicians directly or, using social media itself as a tool to criticize their clinician.
It's a whole new ball game, isn't it? And the misinformation that's out there is really scary as well. So I asked one of my children the other day, where did you get your information from? Oh, TikTok, she said. I said, okay, so how do you know if that information is true or not on TikTok or right? And she said, oh, look at the number of likes it has. Oh, no.
Okay.
I said, okay, but what else? She said, well, I look at who's commented. And if it's somebody famous that everyone knows that's commented that's right, that it's right, then that's probably okay. And I was just like, oh, my goodness. So we're no longer believing experts, are we? We're believing popular people that are famous, people that have got big followings. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting perspective. I suppose the answer is get a celebrity patient in to boost your exposure. But I think you're right. I think misinformation is a problem. Where we see that in dentistry in particular is things like, just to give you an example, before and after clinical photographs. So a clinician can put some photographs on their Instagram, for instance, and you have no way of knowing whether those are credible photos of treatment that dentist has performed and completed. And indeed, you have no way of knowing what sits behind the photograph. Was that patient actually happy with the treatment? Was the dentist a good communicator? Did they deliver on what the patient was expecting out of the treatment? None of that is delivered through a short Instagram posting, is it?
No, and that leads me on to the thing I'd like to talk about is complaints, doctor on doctor or dentist on dentist or, interprofessional, because we've talked a bit on this podcast before in association with the Medical Protection Society, and we'll put the links in the show notes about how to deal with failure, manage yourself through complaints and things like that. But what about when it's one of your colleagues complaining about you. And I can imagine that when you see in social media some misinformation being spread by some quite prominent characters who identify as doctors or as dentists, or my pet bugbear is nutritionists. There are some absolutely fantastic, very good nutritionists out there. Big shout out to the Doctor's Kitchen, because they are brilliant, and a GP that runs that, really good stuff. But there's some stuff out there that is just completely wrong and making people spend so much money on stuff that's not going to help or might even be dangerous. And when you see that, you think, someone's got to do something about this. They need to be reported to the GMC for putting that on Instagram, you know. But that's not always helpful, is it? But I think that is a reaction when we as healthcare professionals see another healthcare professional doing something we think is wrong. And the problem is that can be really, really destructive, can't it? I mean, there's that macro level of you don't know them at all. They're on social media. They're a prominent figure. But then there's that micro level of people you might even be working with.
Yeah, and I think to the point we've just been talking about in regards to social media perhaps not accurately representing things, the same is true of the impression that one clinician might gain of another. It's a very narrow insight into what's going on, and there's always a story that sits behind what might be causing you concern. I think you're right. I think, you know, what we would say is blue on blue, you know, is the term used for these so-called clinicians complaining about other clinicians, and they've absolutely got their place. Don't get me wrong. You know, if you see something taking place that's putting patient care at risk, of course you have an ethical and a professional responsibility to raise those concerns. But it doesn't always have to be the case that you have to reach for the nuclear option and refer them to the regulator. It's important, I think, to look behind what your motivation is for making that report and whether indeed the mechanism that you have in mind is the most appropriate mechanism, or whether there might be something more suited.
Because why is it that most of us, I've never done this, but a lot of blue on blue complaints are directly to the regulator? They're directly already at the escalation stage rather than starting from the bottom of the escalation pyramid, which is something I'd like to ask you about in a bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think there's probably two reasons. I think one is a misunderstanding of the mechanisms that are available. So using that escalation process, making sure that you are pitching your complaint or concern at the right level to get it dealt with effectively, but proportionately. And I think the other reason, and this is perhaps more cynically pitched, is that if an individual has themselves been the recipient of a complaint to the regulator, particularly by another professional, then emotionally, I think often the response is to retaliate with a similar complaint to the same regulator. And so I think it's really important to really, I suppose, look inwards before you make any reports, any complaints, really scrutinize your own motivations for doing that, and take advice so that you can understand whether indeed that is the most appropriate course of action to get the outcome that you're looking for.
There's so much in that, isn't there? So I think, first of all, yes, it's the motivation. Like, why is it that I'm making this complaint? Is it to correct stuff that's factually wrong? In which case, yeah, why would you go to the GMC? Why wouldn't you just message them? And I know, you know, when we put stuff out on Instagram about burnout and stress and resilience, if we ever get any pushback from people or complaints or people write to us, occasionally we do get some feedback about stuff. I take it really seriously, and I always change things. I always look at what we're doing and thinking, is that right or not? So I think people maybe assume that their feedback isn't going to be listened to. I think that, firstly, most feedback is really listened to, and it's really, really valuable. So there is that motivation about, is it because I want to correct stuff out there? I guess when it comes to the social media type stuff, there might be a bit of jealousy on people's, you know, if there's a very, very prominent doctor or psychologist in the media, people just want to have a pop at them, don't they? And, you know, I do think that happens a bit as well.
I think that's absolutely right. So I'm joining you today, actually, as it happens, from Hong Kong. MPS has a presence all around the world, and one of our significant jurisdictions is Hong Kong. And so I'm over here at the moment listening to colleagues talk to me around the challenges that they face in their own professional lives. Because Hong Kong is so, if I just give it as an example, because I think it is relevant to the UK and beyond, it's such a densely populated area that the competition is so high. You can have a dental practice on floor 30 of a building, a dental practice on floor 32 and another one on floor 34. So it's so easy for patients to walk and move between one practice and another. So there is that real competitive spirit between the practices. So using that mechanism of complaint, be it in relation to social media, be it in relation to advertising, which we see particularly over here where it is really heavily regulated, it is very often used, unfortunately, as a mechanism for that, I suppose, competition for space in the market. And if you transfer that across to the UK, it's definitely the case, probably not as concentrated, but we do see complaints from clinicians arising from the practice down the road. It's very rare that you get complaints from somebody that is remote from your own practice. Invariably, it is linked in some way to proximity and therefore competition for patients.
I have definitely seen it in hospitals' apartments where there's been some private practice going on and there's a new kid on the block and there's a sort of consortium of consultants that don't like this new kid on the block. And invariably, within the first couple of years, a GMC referral will be made by one of the other consultants in the department. I've seen that happen quite a few times. It's really despicable behaviour.
It is, and generally speaking, the regulators don't like to be the battleground for these interprofessional disputes. I mean, as I said at the outset, it's absolutely right that some complaints are referred to the regulator, but I think sometimes the challenge lies in how easily done it is. You can report someone now in the space of 5 minutes on an online web form. You press the submit button, you shut the lid of your laptop or you lock the screen on your phone and you carry on with your day. But what you have just initiated in doing that is a significant process that's going to have a huge emotional turmoil on the recipient and incidentally can't be stopped. Once you start that process going, particularly so far as the GDC is concerned, they will investigate it. You cannot wake up the next morning and think, actually, perhaps I was a bit hot-headed in sending that off. Perhaps the appropriate thing might have been to have a chat to this individual and ask the GDC if you can withdraw the complaint. The GDC will say, investigation's been opened and we need to look into this now.
That's really quite sobering, and it is often a very long process, isn't it? Can I just ask you very quickly, how quickly will they throw out, if it's obviously vexatious or malicious or malignant, does it still take them a year to sort it out, or can they look at that pretty quickly and go, actually, there's absolutely no grounds for investigating here?
Well, there's two answers to that. First of all, if I can, let me just indulge you with my personal experience. So I was reported to the GDC 10 years ago. And admittedly, the GDC has improved considerably in that time, and I'm not suggesting it would be the same timescales today. But in that situation, which related to a single patient that I had seen on one occasion for an emergency appointment, it took 9 months for the GDC to write to me and tell me that I'd done nothing wrong and they were closing their case. And that was 9 months at a very, difficult time. I relatively new into the profession, had just bought my new first house, got a mortgage, starting to make financial commitments. And then ultimately you're facing a process that could lead to your erasure from the register and the end of your career. So that's, you can't underestimate or understate that. There has been progress made. It'd be unfair of me to suggest otherwise, but we are still looking at cases that take a number of months, even the most straightforward cases, to be closed at that initial triage stage. And if you are unfortunate enough to be in the situation of a complaint that goes all the way through the process to a hearing, well, hearings are now being scheduled well into 2026, 2027. So you're looking at years. If you were to get a complaint today that went to a hearing, you'd be looking at years, months, certainly not weeks or days for that to be resolved.
And that takes so much of an emotional toil, doesn't it? We'll talk about that in a minute. But I guess one of the questions you'd ask is, would you inflict that on anybody? Even if it's someone that, you don't like particularly, that toil. And doctors, speaking from my own experience of luckily I've never been referred to the GMC. I've had complaints, but I was never referred to the GMC, but I had colleagues that were. And it took 2 or 3 years, and they were all exonerated. And even if you actually know in your head, you're very unlikely to be struck off. And the recent numbers that I've heard from, certainly amongst doctors, medical doctors referred to the GMC, that most people don't end up in the fitness to practice committee unless they've been really bad, unless they've done something criminal or they've shown absolutely no insights. And actually the reality is you can make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We know we do. And if you have some insight and you show you've learned and all that sort of stuff, you're very, very unlikely to be struck off. So in our heads, we know, in your head, you knew there was probably a 0 chance of you being struck off, or you might be suspended for a couple of months, maybe, but actually you're not going to lose it. But it is such an emotionally difficult process, and it's there at the back of the mind all the time. There must be other reasons, not just am I going to be struck off or not, for that process to be so prominent and cause so many issues for doctors and dentists and other healthcare professionals that are going through it.
I mean, you're absolutely spot on. Of course you are, and I think first of all, I think you are right to say that the vast majority of cases will be closed without the ultimate sanction of erasure. It is a really tiny, tiny percentage. And when you look at the cases that lead to erasure, it is right that those individuals are removed from the register. Okay, it's right for the profession, it's right for the public. We're not talking isolated clinical errors, we're talking criminality and such serious matters. But you do go on that emotional journey. You wake up every morning, you go to work and you have a coffee with someone in the cold light of day, and you kind of see things with really good perspective, and you think, no, this is going to come to nothing. But by the time midnight comes along and you've been sitting, tossing and turning for 3 hours, you can very quickly catastrophize yourself up to, I'm going to be erased from the register and this is the end of my career. So I think it's so important to keep that in mind when you make a complaint. And I do want to emphasize that I'm not putting the point here that you shouldn't escalate things to the GDC. Absolutely right. There are cases where indeed you have a professional responsibility, and to not raise escalate concerns, you would be putting your own registration at risk. But if the matter can be effectively dealt with at a more local level, then that is in everyone's best interests, not least the person that would be the recipient of the complaint.
Do you think people just go straight to the regulator because it's the easy way to do it? It's the easy way out. And to me, it just seems like the coward's way out.
Yeah, I think certainly the easy way. Certainly, it takes a lot of resource to investigate a complaint properly, particularly those that have multiple patients involved or systems and process matters to be considered. It is helpful to have the GDC there for those, I think, cynically looking at it to kind of take that burden on themselves and have the resource to investigate it. I do, however, think that a lot of the motivation is a lack of understanding, that actually you don't have to go to the ultimate arbiter. Let's give an example. You see a patient and you are a little concerned about the approach that the other dentist has taken. Okay, it might not be totally unprofessional, just you think actually not quite how I think this should have been done. That's not the remit of the GDC. The GDC is there to deal with those individuals who, if the allegations are found proved, would not be fit to practice. They should not be a dentist. That's ultimately what you're saying. And it's got to be better for patients. It's got to be better for the profession, for those types of complaints to be dealt with and investigated at a local level, whether that's within the hospital trust department or whether that's within a particular dental practice. And I think there's 2 ways to support that. One is training, so having an effective training process so that everyone in the practice is aware of both their obligations but also the mechanisms for escalating concerns, but also the need to ensure that you have a really visible process and you have somebody that takes ultimate responsibility for complaints handling or dealing with interprofessional concerns within any setting. And if you have that, then anybody with a concern should have confidence in that process such that they don't feel the drive to go to the regulator to deal with their concerns.
Yeah, the problem with that, though, George, is that I hear there's a local expression, it's probably a national expression, secondary care doctors, oh yeah, I datixed him. I datixed them. And I think datix is the reporting system. So it seems like, yes, the hospital thought, right, we need to make this way of reporting errors. They probably, I'm hoping it was from good motivation. They'd probably read the Amy Edmondson stuff about the good organization reports the mistakes and errors so that they can learn from them and all that. But that just seems to be weaponized. So you datix someone, or you just ignore it totally because it's too difficult to say anything and you think it's easier not to. So I think even when there are structures in place to deal with things locally, they either get weaponized or they get ignored. And so you keep putting these datixes in and nothing seems to ever be done. Nothing's fed back to you. So then you lose confidence in the process.
Yeah, I think that's really fair challenge on both counts. So, in general dental practice, there certainly, you will have individual processes. We wouldn't have a datix process, but you're right. Certainly in hospital trusts, datix, it's definitely got its positive points because it allows individuals to raise concerns without having to have necessarily difficult conversations. And let's face it, not everyone is comfortable having those kind of discussions. And okay, yes, it's still being weaponized. I concede that point. But if I was going to be on the receiving end of a weaponized process, I'd much rather have to have a difficult conversation with a hospital manager following a datix report than I would to be having to go through an investigation with the GDC or GMC. And I think, we have to take a pragmatic approach here. There has to be a process in place. There has to be a system in place. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be really difficult to get to the place where you have a system that is totally free of being weaponized. I should also say, Rach, I think it's important to make the point that, yes, these things do get weaponized, but we are talking, relatively low numbers. Okay, so the GDC clinician on clinician complaints account for less than 10% of concerns that land on the GDC's desk. And by and large, clinicians are very good, very capable and confident to have those difficult discussions. I will very often receive phone calls into dental protection from colleagues who say, actually, I'm concerned about my colleague. I'm going to go knock on their surgery door at lunchtime. I want to have a chat with them. Have you got any pointers for how to open that discussion? So, it is happening. I think we can and should do better. And I think really that needs to be the direction forward.
And I think that's really good. And what's really heartening is that actually people can phone you up and go, what should I do about this? And is that something that the medical protection, dental protection would really invite people to do?
Absolutely. I think in any situation where you have concerns about another professional, we would always be happy to have that conversation. Now, what you're not going to get out of me, and I suspect my colleagues as well, is an answer of yes, you need to, or no, you don't need to report them to the regulator. We're not there to take away that decision-making burden, which unfortunately has to sit with the individual that is closer to the situation. But what we can say is, have you tried discussing it with the individual? Have you explored what mechanisms are in place in the organization you're working? And if you're having a conversation with us in which you're saying, look, there are serious concerns here that are repeating, that are not being resolved despite me following all those processes, then it may be that we say to you, well, look, you have a professional responsibility and you need to be mindful of that. And perhaps it is appropriate for you now to give consideration to what other mechanisms of escalation you have at your disposal.
It is always useful to sense check stuff with a neutral party. I was just thinking, would you go to a colleague and talk about it first before you came to sort of your medical protection society? But actually, I'm thinking sometimes your colleague is sort of as invested as you are, or as sort of can feel a bit aggrieved as well, or whatever. And so actually getting a very neutral perspective, I think, would be helpful.
Sometimes being too close to it, knowing the personalities and all the negative connotations that can come with that perspective. But also, perhaps a better example is, we get so often now colleagues will go to forums for advice. So they'll ask on Facebook. There's a very famous Facebook group with tens of thousands of dentists on. Now, if you seek advice there, you'll get the whole range of answers. And you'll be given answers from someone who, again, can type a response and shut the lid of the laptop, and they've got no interest in the repercussions. So if they say, yeah, you need to go to the GDC, then it's very easy to write those few words, isn't it? But then you're the one that then has to make those difficult decisions ultimately, and you get drawn into that process. So yeah, it's an absolute difficult balancing act. And I think the objectivity which dental protection or medical protection can provide, particularly because our advice is in the best interest of the person ringing us up, can be invaluable in those situations.
Yeah, I've certainly seen there's a very large physicians Facebook group. And yeah, someone will say, can I have advice about this? This is what happened. And people are going, report, report, report. That's awful. That's awful. And you're thinking, well, yeah, if you put it like that, it sounds awful, but there's going to be context around that. And I know in our own organisation, we're not seeing patients anymore, but when something has been done wrong or something happened, I used to react like and go, well, this was wrong. This needs to be sorted. Now the first thing I say is, oh, what happened here? Let's hear what happened. And the explanation always makes it feel far less serious than it felt. So I really try and say, it's like, oh, I've noticed this. What happened? They're like, oh my word, I'm so sorry. And often that's exactly what you want. You just want somebody to be aware of what happened and an explanation of why it happened, and to know it's not going to happen again. And that is done much, much better with an initial conversation. But what I think people have trouble doing, it's raising it in the first place.
It is. You're right. I think two reasons. One, it's just uncomfortable, right? And sometimes the person you're speaking to, you will know them, and they may be a difficult character. You might anticipate some challenges with that conversation. And also, I think clinicians are always mindful of what repercussions it might have on them, particularly when it comes to these so-called blue on blue complaints. The fact that it is not uncommon, unfortunately, for somebody that complains about one clinician to be the recipient of a similar complaint in the other direction. And so I do think those challenges do muddy the water a bit, and why getting objective support and advice can be so valuable. I think just to your point there, Rachel, around context being key, just to kind of add some illustration to that, I deal with cases across Asia, the UK, Caribbean, and I have a very set process for how I look at them. I would always start with the patient's complaint, and I'll get to the end of the patient's complaint and I'll think, goodness me, this is awful. The patient's been really badly treated here. And then I'll read the dentist or the dental professional's comments, and all of a sudden the mist clears and you think, actually, there was a reason why they did that. Or, okay, there's some context here that actually changes my perception. If I could put it like this, that I think a lot of complaints raised by colleagues against another colleague are often given very little thought, and often very hot-headed in the way they're sent off. And it is back to the point I was saying about how easy it is to raise a complaint on the GDC website. And my advice is really simple to anybody that's thinking of raising concerns. It is extremely rare that you will come across an issue that has to be raised there and then. Very often, the vast majority of cases can wait for 24 hours with zero impact. And so drafting an email and letting that email sit in your drafts rather than clicking the send button and then going to bed and sleeping on it and coming to it with a fresh pair of eyes the following morning can be invaluable. And the number of times I have in my professional life written an email, and by the way, you feel a lot better just for writing it. It's not the sending necessarily. And then just letting it sit there, come to it the next day. And I would say, more than 50% of occasions, I then press the delete button and I think better of it. And I, have a bit more perspective and I've calmed down a little. So, as a very simple bit of advice from me would be, if you want to raise concerns about a colleague and you're not sure how to do it, put your thoughts in writing. don't press the send button, and then review it the next day and see how you feel.
The power of the pause, right? When you're in that sympathetic zone, your amygdala's going, oh, you're going to do something here. That's the time when you absolutely shouldn't do it. Yeah, absolutely. The amount of emails I haven't sent, and I've been so pleased. So then you wait 24 hours and you think, well, actually, no, I do need to either send the email or have a conversation. I'm thinking a conversation would be far better than an email if possible. Is that right?
I think it is, because I think a lot of tone gets lost in email, and communication is only a small part what we say, and a large part of body posture, gestures, facial expressions. And I think, when you're communicating something like that, having those additional cues to support the communication are so important. But having said that, if you then do not feel that your concerns have been properly listened to or acted upon, then having it in writing is really helpful, because if you are later criticized for not dealing with it appropriately, having that record, that audit trail of what you said is also of great importance. And the way I would advise kind of ticking both of those boxes is it doesn't hurt to have the conversation and then to just gently say at the end of the conversation, so perhaps it'd be easy for both of us, to help both of us out, if I just summarize what we've agreed and I'll pop it in an email to you. It's a nice way of kind of tying someone's hands to an action, but also providing that audit trail.
Would you advise giving them a bit of a warning shot, like saying in an email, can I pop over? I've got just some concerns about this patient, or someone came to see me and I just want to understand a bit more, or would you just leave that till you see them?
That's a really good question. Now, my personal view, I hate emails that say, can I have a word?
Yeah. you worry about it.
You
like,
just think,
God, what's coming?
Oh, what is it? Yeah. So my personal, if I'm the recipient, I would just rather you rip the plaster off, walk in my room and say, I need to talk to you about this and this. I think if you're going to give someone a warning, advance notice in an email, because that can be helpful. It can give, if you want to talk about something specific. So let's say you want to talk about a particular patient. I think absolutely can be helpful to give them the notice so they can go and review those records. They can remind themselves of the patient, and you can have a more constructive discussion. Because otherwise what you're going to get when you knock on their door is, look, I can't remember the detail, give me some time to read the records, and you're just kicking the can down the road when you've gone to that room having built up the courage to have that difficult conversation. But what I would say, just to be kinder, is give enough information in the email. You can say, look, I saw Mr. Smith this morning, had some concerns around his appointment with you last Tuesday. Have you got some time later on today to discuss it? So there's none of that kind of cloak and daggers, I want to have a word about something serious and you don't tell them what it is. I just think it's my personal view is it's just not a kind way of dealing with people.
It's interesting, though. I think people avoid having these conversations. And you've already mentioned that when you're talking to another colleague going, how should we feed this back? Oh, no, they'll take it really badly or whatever. Well, we often really assume that person is going to be defensive. They're going to take it badly. They'll be a real arsehole when we feed back to them. But my colleague Sarah always quotes that we overestimate the negative impact of having a conversation and we underestimate the negative impact of not having that conversation.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, clinicians in general are really invested in their own abilities and their own performance. And they are keen to know when they are not doing something. Now, a lot of this conversation has naturally kind of drawn towards the sinister motive side. We've got someone doing it really bad and we've got to have a really difficult conversation. But actually, if it is something, let me think of an example. Let's say receptionist has noticed that all the patients coming out of my surgery are saying that they feel like I didn't take the time to welcome them into the surgery. Now, to somebody, that might be a difficult conversation to go and speak, because I might be quite a bullish character, I might be quite dismissive, but equally, I might be totally oblivious to this. And if somebody says to me, actually, George, we've had a couple of patients that just happened to mention that they quite like the way that the previous dentist used to welcome into the surgery and offer, to take their coat, or I don't know, ask them how their day's going or how their holiday was or something. And that might give me the opportunity to say, oh, yeah, no, I hadn't thought of that. My impression was that patients want to be in and out as quickly as possible, and that's why I'm rushing. It's not because I'm rushing, it's because I think that's what the patient wants. I'm really pleased you brought this to my attention, and I'll do that in future. So it's probably not the best example, but I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of clinicians are insightful, are keen to develop, and would prefer to have these kind of blind spots brought to their attention.
Yeah, and I always think that feedback is a total gift, and we don't get enough feedback. And this is one of my real bugbears at the moment. We teach a model of difficult conversation having, a framework for difficult conversations called the high five model. And the high in the high five model stands for highest intent. And you were talking about the fact that we have been assuming a lot of the conversations we've had that, that the person's bad or they've got some malicious either intent by complaining, or the doctor or dentist being complained about is lazy or something like that. And that is just hardly ever the case, isn't it? There are some bad eggs in the basket, but mostly people are overwhelmed, they're stressed, they're, struggling with work. And we had Dr. Chris Turner on the podcast recently talking about, what to do when you're the difficult person. And he said he does a lot of appraisals. He's the founder of Civility Saves Lives movement. There's a lot of appraisals, and he sort of gets given the people that have been complained about or assumed to be difficult characters or lazy. People have thought they're lazy or not really doing their job properly. And he said, in all his time of seeing these people, that not one of them is lazy. There's other factors at work. They're getting to be burnt out. There's just too much going on. There's difficult interpersonal relationships, all that. And so most of us go to work to do a good job, don't we? And most of us, when we're raising complaints about other people or notice that something wrong, are doing it because genuinely we're worried and concerned about the treatment that patients have had. So if both of you think about your highest intent in that conversation, so why am I having this conversation? If it is vexatious and malicious because they're competition for me in my practice, well, I won't be thinking about the highest intent anyway. I'll just be doing despicable things. So let's exclude that lot of people. But if we're thinking, well, what do I want out of this conversation? I just want to feedback so they don't do it again, or feedback so that they're aware, or just understand more. Then that's got to be quite a good way of going into the conversation. And even would you advise stating it? So just saying, look, I just wanted to check something out because something happened. I've noticed something and I was just a bit worried. I just want to flag it up in case you hadn't seen it and just check in with you about what was going on and just understand what happened, just so that I'm clear that we're both working to the best of our ability or something like that.
Yeah, and what I would say is that I think these so-called difficult conversations, and they are, I'm not minimizing that, but it does get easier. And I think the more that you have those difficult discussions with your colleagues, the more it will become almost a casual, chat over the water cooler. So it becomes for both parties a conversation of much less significance. I don't mean by that it gets dealt with any less seriously. It is just that it's in the rearview mirror of both parties a lot quicker, and you're not dwelling on it for the rest of the day. Did I say the right thing? How has it been received? Or the recipient's thinking, I feel totally outraged that they've come to me with this. And I think what can really help that is it's part of a broader culture piece. And that involves offering the positive as well as the negative feedback. And I think that is something that in clinical dental practice, we are particularly poor at. If a patient goes to see someone and let's say that the usual dentist is on holiday and they say, I normally see George, and by the way, George is lovely. He always puts me at ease. I've always struggled with going to the dentist, but I finally found someone I feel comfortable with. Then I would say, make a note of that really quickly. And then when George gets back from holiday, go and knock on his door and say, have you got 2 minutes? I saw Mrs. Smith last week. She said you were lovely. She said you've really put her at ease, and she feels much more comfortable coming to the dentist now. And you will make that person's day. You will feel better for it, and it then means that when you need to go and have the difficult conversation, you've got a much better relationship of exchange of feedback with them. Because in a sense, positive feedback is also a difficult conversation, because you're still having to use all of those communication tools, learn to go and interact with your peers, sometimes senior colleagues. So I think it's all good in terms of building up that skill base.
Yeah, and sometimes we don't have those positive conversations because it feels awkward. You're right. They are still challenging conversations, like, oh, does it feel a bit icky to tell George that his patient thought he was really good? But I think we just need to start thinking of feedback as data. This is some data. George, we've got some data for you. The patients like it when you do this.
Yes. Yeah.
I've also got some data for you that they don't like it when you do that.
Yes. Yeah. And then it's up to the recipient what they do with that data. And I think that's the really important piece, because, in the context of raising concerns to another clinician, there's two phases to it. One is imparting the information, and there are certain situations where it's then over to them, and you're, I suppose, to a point, your responsibility is discharged at that point of handing that over. An example might be the one I gave about not welcoming them to the surgery. Now, that's not something that you're going to knock on the GDC's door with. It's not something that necessarily you're going to lose any sleep over. It's just good negative feedback. It's just, here's a heads up. Here's something you could do that's going to cost you nothing, take no time, but will apparently have an impact on your patients and how they perceive you. Over to you. Now, you may choose not to start welcoming your patients in the way that's been suggested, or you may choose to totally overhaul how you're interacting with your patients when they walk in the door. That's a matter for you. And that's why I love the data point, because feedback is just an exchange of information, and then how it's acted upon is a totally separate level. Now, there will be occasions, just to kind of go back to the more serious side of the spectrum, where actually you are invested in that data and how it's used, and you have to follow it up. It isn't enough to say, we've had reports from a couple of patients that you're not putting gloves on before you clinically examine them, and then that's it, I'm not going to do anything. You then, of course, need to make sure the feedback's been acted upon, and something's been put in place to make sure that's been properly addressed. And if it hasn't, that's the point at which you might want to be picking up the phone to us and taking advice on how you escalate those concerns.
Yes, I was going to ask that. So what happens if someone continues doing that thing you fed back to them about? You've had that conversation. I heard a phrase the other day that a mistake made more than once is a decision. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Although I must say I make mistakes more than once all the time, unknowingly. But yeah, if you've had that behaviour fed back to you and you've decided to keep doing it, then you do have to escalate. So what advice would you be giving if I phoned you up and said, right, I've had the conversation, they weren't particularly receptive, they were a bit defensive about it, and it's happened again?
Well, let's take it as a given that everyone listening has done the first stage, which is to make sure you've got an effective process in place. Okay, so if you don't have that in place, then it makes this bit very difficult, because following on from the difficult conversation and putting it in writing, as I've suggested previously, is to escalate it in-house. So that might be clinical director, it might be practice manager, might be practice principal, but whatever setting you're working in, there will be a hierarchy to some extent. There will be someone with whom the buck stops, and you can escalate your concerns to them. My suggestion at that point is put it in writing. You want an audit trail. You want to be able to evidence that you have executed your professional responsibility appropriately. Thereafter, it's helpful to monitor it. Of course, there will be situations where you're not entitled to know how things are dealt with, and nor would it be appropriate, and the conversation ends at you escalating it. But there will be circumstances where, if you think patients are being put at risk, you do want to monitor how that's being dealt with. And if after escalating in a local setting, as far as you can, you find that nothing is being done, then it is at that point that you definitely do need to start to consider escalating your concerns to the regulator. But I would say three things before you do that. First off, you would be really well advised to speak to your indemnifier. And as I've as I've already said, dental protection, medical protection, we would be more than happy to have that conversation just to sense check. And often actually, rather than sense checking, what we're doing is just exploring with you other options, not necessarily saying which one to take. We're just giving you the menu so that you can make your choice. And then I would say really read the guidance. The GDC and the GMC all have their own guidance on escalating concerns to them, the types of things they deal with, and the types of things they don't. And then the third one, which again I've alluded to, is just take a breath. There's very little that you need to deal with absolutely there and then. Even pretty serious stuff, you can go and have a cup of tea and sit down for half an hour just to compose your thoughts. And then, if you are left with the conclusion that it's appropriate to raise it to the GDC, then you have to, of course, act as you think is professionally appropriate. It's then a matter for you how you deal with it with the individual. I've seen it happen both ways. I've seen individuals get complained about where the first they knew about it was a letter from the regulator. And I've had a case very recently where actually the directors of the practice wrote to the individual and said, just a heads up that we have had to refer this to the GDC. This is the information we've given them. We're very sorry that we've had to do this, but hope you'll appreciate the difficult position that we were placed. It's then a matter for the individual how you choose to approach that. There's no right or wrong. I think it depends on the relationship that you have. But really, I would say in a practice setting where, unfortunately, because of the management structures, invariably the person that you are complaining about, you know them personally, you're very close to them by kind of nature of the proximity you work with them in the practice. And so, you can be the good and the bad guy. You can say, look, we've had some really difficult conversations. Nothing's changing. We have a professional obligation. We've had to raise this to regulator. But second part to that, appreciate that's really difficult and we want to support you through the process, and here's some signposting to support. I know that could be seen as disingenuous. I know that could be not particularly well received by the individual. But if you are raising concerns for the right reasons at the right times for the right things, then I don't see it as totally unreasonable for those two to go hand in hand, and you can be good and bad cop in one.
Yeah, I totally agree. But the problem I'm thinking about is that obviously a lot of our listeners are GPs and they're dealing with patients that have been seen by secondary care. And so they are spotting issues that have happened in secondary care, or secondary care spotting issues that happen in general practice. And it's much, much harder these days to pick up the phone and have a conversation with that person. So although it's not impossible, would you still be saying, look, just see what you can do to actually speak to that person?
Yeah, I would, to be perfectly honest with you. I absolutely take your point about primary, secondary care proximity challenges, and we see that a lot as well in dental practice, for instance, between general dentists and specialists, perhaps an orthodontist. A really good example is where a dentist has taken the wrong tooth out and they're blaming the orthodontist because it was written wrong on the referral, and vice versa. And actually, based on my experience over the last 10 years of dealing with these cases, the ones that are dealt with much more efficiently, much more effectively for the patient gets the best outcome, the clinicians get the best outcome, are the cases where the two pick the phone up to each other and talk it out. Now, the caveat to that is that you can only go so far with that, can't you? And busy practices, and sometimes difficult to get contact details, and you want to maintain professional boundaries. So yeah, I get there are all sorts of challenges to that approach, but wherever possible, I'm a huge advocate for just sitting two people in one room and bashing their heads together to sort it out. And 9 times out of 10, you can do that.
Yeah. And I always think, well, what would I want if I was that person? So, if I was that surgeon in secondary care, the GP's noticed a mistake or something with bedside manner and, it really needs addressing, I would much rather have a phone call and say, look, I just wanted to talk to you about this. I thought it might be useful feedback for you, whatever, then hear about it the first time through either the regulator or through the hospital official liaison complaint process. But it's hard, and it may be that I need to talk to colleagues about that and approach it together and discuss with the colleagues about how best to do that. I think with the best will in the world, even if someone has really explained why they're escalating and things like that, you still might feel quite pissed off. or you feel very upset about it. I mean, we're not talking about the minor stuff. You have a conversation. Oh yeah, okay. I noticed I was a bit grumpy that day. Yeah, I can change that. But we have made a big error. Someone said, actually, we are going to need to escalate this, and they have complained about you. That is really difficult on all sorts of levels. Firstly, was the fact there's a complaint going through. We talked about that earlier. But secondly, that interpersonal level, I think I would be feeling a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment. And we know that actually when people feel shame and embarrassment, then that often comes out as defensiveness and artiness. And actually I could be then behaving quite badly towards that person. And I'm sure you've seen that as well. So what do we do when it's us?
Great question. I think, first of all, if it's somebody knocking on your door, coming to speak to you, recognize how difficult that's been for them.
Yeah, the courage it would have taken, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And recognize that the alternative options were up to and including reporting you to the regulator. So as far as possible, deal with it constructively, recognizing that, because the more you do that, the more they will come and knock on your door the next time, and the more you will have the opportunity to address these things at a very local level without all the unnecessary stress of that escalation. But also just take time out to reflect rather than going with the instinctive response. Because, I think dentists and doctors, we are naturally high achievers. We're so used to going through a very rigorous educational pathway that has driven us to become these almost robotic individuals that cannot possibly face any challenge or criticism. And I know for one, I used to receive feedback really badly. I'm probably still not great. I still naturally err on the very defensive side, but I'd like to think that I have driven myself to get better at it. And my personal approach now is to just take some time out and really force yourself to look into the uncomfortable parts of your professional life and really reflect on the feedback you've been given and think, actually, have they got a point? And you don't necessarily have to agree with feedback in order to accept it, do you? If you go back to the data point, you can receive it, you can thank the individual for it, and then you can store it away in a metaphorical drawer and not necessarily do anything to act upon it. Because some feedback will be, if we use my example earlier, if the patients don't like the way you're greeting your patients, some patients might love that. Or some patients might come to you because you are a little bit less small talk and you get on with things. So you might decide, actually, well, that's fine. If they want to have that, they can go and see you. That's a benefit of the fact we both work here, and I'll stick with doing things my way. I've got no issue with that. And I think that's important, that you recognize that not all feedback needs to be acted upon. But also, I think having that courage to alter your approach and to think, okay, feedback from my nurses, for example, that I'm abrupt in how I speak to them. I've now had that feedback. It's on me to, from this point forward, make a real conscious effort to fix that. And you mentioned earlier before about two mistakes being intentional, and that's me paraphrasing your words. But also, a lot of clinical practice is habitual. If you've been in practice for 20 years, you will have a particular patter. I remember I used to say to patients the same phrases. We'd moan about the weather. My nurse would roll her eyes because, God, I've heard this script 30 times today already. So to change that approach based on that feedback is really difficult. So don't expect instant results either, but be prepared to work at developing and improving. And if that means, a criticism of your clinical practice, be prepared to go on a course, do some CPD, address those shortcomings, maybe work with the person giving you the feedback to see how they can support you. Because if they are supportive enough to knock on your door and have that difficult conversation, then I'd bet some decent money they'd be happy to support you to address it as well.
I think the phrase that's coming to me is that feedback is a total gift. So you're right. If that person is taking the time to do that, then they've stepped up to do it, and you need to listen. The problem is, just like you said, in medicine, it's all about, are we perfect or not? And, the way that we've been trained, you've got to get every single answer right, every single diagnosis right, and never fail and never get anything wrong. And so when you're when you get the data that actually you have done something that's caused other people pain, possibly, or suffering or distress, you feel really bad because you don't want to ever cause anyone suffering or make a mistake. So there's that, like, oh no, I've done harm to somebody else, or that's not worked. There's that. But then there's the shame of, gosh, I'm not good enough. I'm not enough. And when you've been judged all your life by what you produce, what you do, how good you are, then that's really hard to cope with. And then the first thing we tend to do is become very, very defensive and try and explain why we did it. And I remember when I would get complaints, the first thing I did is look back and make sure it wasn't my fault, make sure I didn't do anything wrong. And that's all well and good, but actually, what if I had done something wrong? I need to be able to tolerate it when I am in the wrong, because I know I can change. But we really struggle with that.
We do. And I think what we need to do is normalize mistakes and normalize complaints and try to remove some of that stigma. And I think the dentist that tells you they don't get a complaint, it's one of two things. Either they're lying or they don't have an effective process in place to capture them.
One thing that I've noticed as well is my instinct would be, if someone comes to tell you gives you some feedback, you're like, okay, well, let's just keep this very confidential, but thank you for telling me, and I'll change whatever. But actually, when I have shared stuff that's gone wrong, times where I think I've really mucked up, when I've had negative feedback and stuff, it's made me feel so much better. And I end up now sharing it on the podcast with thousands of people. But it's so helpful. Brené Brown says shame cannot survive being spoken. So the minute you tell someone about the mistake you've made or the feedback that you've got, it just dissipates, because everyone goes, oh yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, what are you going to do? And gosh, that happened to me. And interestingly, in all the emails we get from people about the podcast, it's mostly saying, oh, when you told that story about when you mucked up, oh, that made me feel so much better. And it really, really does. It's uncanny, isn't it?
It is. And the same is, it's absolutely true of, things like adverse incidents. So I will often lecture, newly qualified dentists, and I'll say, 2 weeks into my foundation year, I was drilling a patient's tooth and the burr came out of the handpiece and disappeared down the back of their throat. And it was a terrifying moment for me as a newly qualified dentist. But instantly you can just see that almost the relief from those in the audience as they realize, oh, right, okay, and you survived. And I think that's a really nice point to kind of bring in is my GDC experience, which I've spoken about, for me, really was the springboard to a really fruitful career. It opened my eyes to the world of indemnity. It opened my eyes to MPS and dental protection and the great work that they did to support me through that process. And ultimately, I'm convinced that it is ultimately what got me a job with them, doing the work that I do now, supporting other dentists, because the empathy that you get from going through the process is invaluable. And so if I was to meet the chap that complained about me now to the GDC, I'd probably buy him a drink and shake his hand and say, thank you very much. But the serious point is, he never got an apology from me. He never got a refund, and he never got an explanation of why the treatment I provided was appropriate and why, to put it bluntly, he was wrong to raise his complaint. It was misunderstanding, miscommunication. It wasn't bad treatment. Him going to the GDC achieved absolutely nothing. He had to wait 9 months for an answer. I had to wait 9 months for an answer. And if he'd come to the practice directly, he would have got an apology. He'd have got a refund, because, I was, very keen and still am on, building goodwill. And if that's what it takes to keep someone happy, then I will, even if I've done nothing wrong. So he'd have got a lot out of that. And instead, by going for that nuclear option, that opportunity was missed. Now, he didn't have the benefit of being aware of all the local processes that we have. But anyone listening to the podcast working in a healthcare role will know what those local measures are and the processes. So really, it's a gift to go through those local processes. You get much more out of it than going to the regulator, because the regulator is a very cold process that actually, I think, even the complainant doesn't win. It doesn't really get anyone anywhere, save then, as I say, just to drive that point home, that there will be certainly cases that need to go there, and I'm not minimizing that.
The annoying thing about being complained about is that that's where you learn the most. That's where you develop the most. That's where, I look through my careers, it's either where things that have not worked or failed, or negative feedback that I've got, where I've actually learned and changed the most. And that is a really annoying thing about like self-awareness and personal development. You don't develop if everyone's telling you how wonderful you are. You do when they start telling you, well, that could have been done better, or that was a bit rubbish, or this is how it made me feel. So it is a real gift, even if the person doesn't respond like it's a real gift at the time. Before we finish quickly, George, do you have any other tips for what people can do themselves when they are dealing with a complaint that's either gone to the regulator or going through sort of official channels? Because it's such a difficult and anxious and uncertain time. So what would you be advising your members to do as well?
I answer it more how I'd say, advise a friend over coffee. So if a friend of mine came to me and said, look, George, I've got this going on, I would say three things. First of all, I would say take some time out to focus on yourself. It might be you take a week of leave. If it's as bad as, a GMC or GDC complaint, that's only going to happen at worst 1 or 2 times in your career. So it's a really significant event. Put yourself first, take some time out. Secondly, speak to people about it. There is absolutely no reason why we need to bottle these things up. It is not the career-ending calamity that we will initially think it is. And so having the opportunity to draw on that support network is really important. And thirdly, I would say keep perspective. So my back of a napkin calculation, if you see 30 patients a day, 5 days a week, 48 weeks a year for a 30-year career, you're going to see in the region of 250,000 patients or patient interactions. Now, if you have in your career 10 serious complaints, you've still got 249,990 happy patient interactions. So, it's really important that when you get that Christmas card or that gift or the thank you note, I say keep them, put them on display, and then have a box or a drawer that you put them in. So when you get to those really low points, you can open the drawer and just be reminded that actually this is a single event. This is not you and how it defines you as a clinician.
So see it as a significant event if you do get, a serious complaint, and take the time that you need to deal with it. Yeah, I love that about talking to people, get people on your side, because as soon as you share it, it takes the sting out of it. It really does. It might be difficult the first time, but then you'll feel, and you will find that people are really, really supportive of you as well. Generally, people are, aren't they? They're like, oh, thank God that didn't happen to me. What can I do to support you?
Yeah, I remember telling my boss when I got my GDC letter, and I built up the courage to walk in at lunchtime to speak to my boss. And I walked in thinking, this is just going to open the doors to the second tranche of, negativity. I've had the letter and now I'm going to get sacked or suspended or whatever. And actually, my boss just gave me a hug. We had a very close friendship and said, I'm really sorry that you've had that. It seems really unfair. And they were from that point on right through the process incredibly supportive. So the error I made was presupposing how they would deal with it. And I suppose the knock on to that, the point that it'd be great to use this opportunity is if you have a colleague that's in receipt of a complaint. Yes, they sound serious. A complaint to the regulator is serious, but just remember that it doesn't define them as a clinician. It's part of a bigger story. There's always context. And first and foremost, I think as any colleague would want to support them, leave the regulator to make the judgments, and you just be there as a friend and colleague to help them through it.
We had someone on the podcast who was talking about a patient who died by suicide, and they felt incredibly guilty, and lots of people were very supportive. But the one thing that made the difference to them was their boss saying, that happened to me. And they went, oh, that was the one thing. Oh gosh, it wasn't just me. Because you feel like, oh, I'm dreadful. It was just me. So sharing, being vulnerable, telling people your story can all be really helpful. George, that's been really helpful. And if people wanted to sort of contact you or find out more about the work that the Dental Protection Society or Medical Protection Society does, where would you, or they want more stuff around this, where would you point them towards?
Okay, so they can go to our website, which is dentalprotection.org or medicalprotection.org. They can access that from any country that we operate in, and we have country-specific sites. On there is a wealth of information and resource, including access to our e-learning platform, which has a range of webinars for the benefit of members. So I'd encourage anyone with an interest to have a look on there. If anyone wants to get in touch with me personally, if they've enjoyed hearing about my experiences, then they can contact me via LinkedIn. So I'm available on LinkedIn or via the dental protection pages.
Great. So we'll put all those notes in the show notes. And I think we're going to be doing some webinars in association with the Dental Protection Society and Medical Protection Society soon as well. So if you're a member, keep an eye out for that. We'll also make a download of the high five conversation model available in the show notes, just in case anybody wants to look further into that and explore how they might be able to use that. So George, thank you so much for being on. It's been really, really helpful. And I'm certainly going to bear a lot of that in mind. If I ever have to, complain about a doctor myself or a dentist or whatever, it's always better to have the conversation, go locally and don't escalate unless you absolutely have to.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Rachel.